and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about the beginning stages of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 and the relationship between Mao and the Red Guards, who were primarily made up at this point of students. Now, previously I've talked about the Cultural Revolution. It is a complicated and drawn out set of processes, but it can be roughly described, the early phase anyway, can be roughly described like this. Mao had caused himself significant problems by the failure of the Great Leap Forward. This was the attempt to rapidly industrialise China, the second five-year plan, which had ended in disaster, had actually seen the Chinese economy shrink and resulted in a famine which had killed, and the conservative low estimate is 40 million people. An out-and-out catastrophe. And at the Lushan Party Conference in 1959, Mao is openly criticised by Peng Dehuai, and he is sidelined. The running of the state is handed over to Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi. And Mao, for the next couple of years, really goes into a sort of a semi-retirement. He hasn't gone away, and he's planning his return. In that time, Mao believed that capitalist elements were returning to Chinese society, that the reforms that Deng and Liu were introducing, enabling the farmers to the peasants to do a bit of commercial farming in order to restore the economy, was the beginnings of capitalism again. And Mao also believed that from 1949 to 1957 that there had been an insufficient amount done to really root out class enemies. And Mao looked at the Soviet Union and saw the Soviet Union trying to develop more ways to peacefully coexist with the US, and believed that really after Stalin the Soviet leadership had gone soft, and that to be a Khrushchev was seen as the kind of most monstrous accusation of kind of revisionism. And so there was a need in Mao's eyes to reinvigorate the revolution. If you can think about it this way, that the seizure of power in 1949 could be seen as a political revolution, the era of the five-year plans and the Great Leap Forward, an economic revolution. This was going to be a cultural revolution in that the ways in which Chinese people thought about the world were going to be revolutionized. And in 1966, the whole-scale and terrible destruction of traditional Taoist and Buddhist and Confucian culture, the burning of libraries and monasteries and temples and shrines, was a way of attempting to erase aspects of Chinese culture that were potentially oppositional to Maoism. Now, if you read Frank Dakota's trilogy on Mao, The Tragedy of Liberation, Mao's Great Famine, and the Cultural Revolution of People's History, the picture that he gives, and he has been criticised in some quarters for being too relentlessly anti-Maoist. But if you look at the death tolls involved, I wonder if it's actually possible to make that argument that a regime that starved 40 million people to death, is it possible to be too critical of it? I'm not sure. Anyway, Frank Dakota, the point that he makes is that Mao's appeal in 1966, when he returns from exile, is based around the long-standing resentments that many Chinese people have towards the party. Mao distinguishes himself from the party. He says, really, the party have made mistakes, the party has become corrupted. Mao is seen as being separate from this and given a sort of and put in a sort of a hallowed position. In the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, were interesting parallels with this phenomena. Very often, by the end of the 1930s, the Nazi Party is very unpopular, but Hitler himself is seen as a kind of a mighty figurehead and someone beyond reproach. Mao is responsible for an immense amount of the hardships that the Chinese people faced, but he had simmering resentments against the party establishment and the party elite. He believed his way back to power and also his means of revenge was to turn the people on the party. The party isn't the first target, however. The first target is Beijing, and particularly the mayor of Beijing and the educational establishment of Beijing, its schools and universities. Mao had been quite enigmatic for most of the first half of 1966. He'd been travelling the country, his whereabouts had been fairly secret, he'd been on his train, and he then signals his return to public life by swimming in the Yangtze River. It was a very high-profile event, and there were propaganda posters of him. He was in 72 by this point and getting on a bit, but it was his way of showing that he was still a significant force to be reckoned with. A day or two later, he's back in Beijing, and he establishes the Cultural Revolution group at that point. This is much to the unhappiness of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who by the end of the year have been purged. Liu Shaoqi is put under house arrest and he's brutally murdered in the end, where Deng Xiaoping winds up for spending several years working in a bicycle repair shop. He's sent for re-education. And the groups that were established by Liu Shaoqi, called work teams, who are really a kind of a Liu Shaoqi version of the Red Guards, imposing a particular kind of Maoist orthodoxy in schools and universities and attacking students. They're disbanded and their victims exonerated and released from prison, and these form the beginnings of of Beijing's Red Guards. Once the Red Guards begin to be established in Beijing, they start to crop up almost spontaneously across the country. So it's worth pausing for a moment to discuss who the Red Guards were and what they were about. The Red Guards initially, before the end of 1966, are students who are avid, if not fanatical, supporters of Mao. They are readers of Mao's Little Red Book. Mao's Little Red Book was a small collection of Maoist aphorisms and phrases and sayings and teachings that become so wildly popular that enormous resources are set aside, huge, vast quantities of red ink, red plastic for the backings of the books, it becomes almost a super industry in its own right, printing them. The destruction of Chinese culture that begins during 1966, the attack on the Four Olds, means that other than purchasing the Red Book and other trinkets of Mao culture, Maoist posters and pictures and paintings, there is too much fear associated with any other kind of intellectual pursuit. The only outlet for people culturally at all is Maoist culture, and Red Guards spend their times ransacking the homes of Chinese people who have their belongings left after the 17 years of Maoist rule, and taking anything that is considered either feudal, so aspects of older Chinese culture, or bourgeois, so creature comforts and luxuries, and destroying them. There are all sorts of accounts of older Chinese people having their gardens torn up, their furniture smashed, pictures of Confucius or the Buddha or anything of that nature being destroyed, bookcases being torn down, huge bonfires of books lighting up the night, in order to really try to kind of erase any of the culture that had existed in China prior to Maoism. Beijing is gradually plunged into anarchy when the new Red Guard groups across the country are invited to come to the capital, and they are given free transport, free food, and free boarding, in order to make sure that they can get to Beijing and they can parade in front of Mao. Mao becomes rather fond of being able to address a million students at a time. And the city has a capacity for several million inhabitants, but that capacity during the August of 1966 virtually doubles, and it doesn't take a public planning official to think of the pressure on amenities, food, sanitation, accommodation, all these things. The streets become strewn with rubbish and sewage. There are Red Guards sleeping on station platforms and in the street, and the dormitories that are assigned to them overflow. They are garrisoned in people's houses and in schools that have been shut down. And the problem as well is that not all the Red Guards who come to Beijing are ideological Maoists. Many of them are just young people who like the idea of some free travel, some fun and adventure. They are given an inordinate amount of power over their fellow citizens to behave essentially as badly as they like, to be rude and abusive, because it is being done in the name of Chairman Mao, and anyone that answers back is an anti-revolutionary revisionist type, taking the capitalist road. At the start of the Cultural Revolution, all sorts of groups and social organisations believed that there were opportunities really for them to get ahead. They're thinking, well, Mao is throwing all of society's pieces in the air once again, and we can press home our own advantage. But it was students that really were the ones who were principally favoured by Mao. He said, "We have to depend on them, students, to start a rebellion, a revolution. Otherwise we may not be able to overthrow those demons and monsters." And this was a confession to his personal physician. So what this tells us is that Mao was prepared to use young people as a kind of political battering ram to tear down the old establishment which had defied him and which he felt had hurt and humiliated him following the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. The Red Guards began to adopt a kind of a more militaristic look. They started to wear uniforms with a red armband, and they armed themselves in whatever way they could against who they viewed as class enemies. And Mao allowed students to believe that class enemies could be represented by anybody in a position of authority. So particularly teachers were identified. The entry into the Red Guards was particularly prescribed. Only people with good class backgrounds were allowed. So this was initially described as a saying said, if the father is a hero, his son is also a hero. If the father is a reactionary, his son is a bastard. Meaning that a hero meant revolutionary member of the party, people who had clearly done things during the period of, in inverted commas, liberation. This meant that, for example, in Beijing, only 1 in 5 students from middle schools was able to actually join the Red Guards. Later on, Mao dismantles this prescription, and the Red Guards that establish themselves from bad class backgrounds actually turn on the Red Guards from good class backgrounds, because the Red Guards from good class backgrounds began to represent an elite that Mao wanted to have swept away. Despite the freebies on offer to the Red Guards, free transportation, food and accommodation, which, by the way, enabled them not just to go to Beijing, but after they'd been in Beijing, to travel the rest of the country and have really the time of their lives. There are all sorts of Red Guards who write about the wonderful experiences and memories that they have. The actual conditions in which they travelled were pretty squalid. The schools and colleges around China sent delegates to the capital, but they were, when it was realised that they were travelling for free, trains began to fill up not just with delegates, but with all manner of people of about the same age. The class background is interrogated, but you simply have young people piling onto the trains to Beijing. There is the chaos that's creates an environment for lawlessness. There on the trains, there is all sorts of violence and intimidation, pickpocketing and theft, various attacks on women, and the line between revolutionary ardour and criminality is very, very blurred indeed. And the Red Guards, who get a bit of a taste for violence, they don't really lose that. And as China descends further after 1966 into civil war, which is slightly story from another time, the Red Guards become more and more simply the kinds of violent militias you see in failed states around the world. So Frank Dakota writes, as more and more delegates got on board the trains, space ran out. They occupied every available inch, sitting in each other's laps, on the backs of seats, and on the small tables dividing pairs of seats. Some squatted in the aisles, others lay in luggage racks, and still others had squeezed into the lavatories. When the trains came to a halt in the countryside, local ruffians walked up to the windows, feigning interest in the revolutionary cause. Just as the train started to move, they would snatch watches from the wrists, grab bags out of the windows, and even whisk people's glasses off their noses. Some of them pulled knives. Food soon ran out, but in any case, nobody wanted to eat or drink more than the bare minimum. The toilets were always full, and no one wanted to leave the train at stops to relieve themselves for fear of never being able to get back on. So this can be explained as part of the price that Mao was willing to exact in order to return to power. And there were a few bases of support that Mao could have used. Mao had really lost control of the army at this point, and it's only during the process of the Cultural Revolution by 1967 that Mao has really regained control over military force in China. The students offer this ideal springboard, and it would be they would be betrayed by him later on, when Mao believed that the Cultural Revolution had run its course and that he had got from it what he needed. Then Mao would send the students, many of them, for re-education in the countryside, meaning hard, brutal and menial work on peasant farms, the kind of re-education that they had condemned others to during the course of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution itself is thought to have lasted until 1968, so a 2-year period. But it's more realistic to say that it continues until Mao's death in 1976. Mao managed to reinstate himself as the sole figure of authority in China by creating a civil war. But civil wars don't kind of really spring out of the ground. They don't come from nowhere. civil wars are created by deep and long-standing tensions engendered into societies, and those tensions were engendered by Mao himself. It's the next phase of the Cultural Revolution happens in late '66, early '67, when the workers in China's cities decide that they too will rebel. Mao encourages this as well, and by encouraging this, he lets loose all the anger of workers who, despite the promises of communism, had been treated extremely badly. They had been left with huge workplace insecurity, and there were enormous numbers of casualised workers, what we would think of as 0 hours contract workers, who could be dismissed without a by or leave. There were appalling conditions in factories, low wages, poor living conditions, and the brutality of party cadres who were there to ensure that ideological rule was paramount. So there's an immense amount to be angry about, and there were workers whose living conditions had not recovered since the Great Leap Forward. And it's these kinds of tensions that that blow China in two, tear China in two. To mix metaphors there. The students who are the kind of the initial catalyst of the Great Leap Forward, they are really only the first phase of it. The real struggle begins when the mass of the Chinese working class began to fight in the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution becomes a civil war because across the country you have a party establishment attempting to defend itself from rebels inspired by Mao, and in each town and city and province there are divided loyalties, with some workers and students believing that the old establishment, the party itself, needs to be defended, whereas the rebels see themselves as an insurrection against the party establishment that has treated them so badly since 1949. And the great irony is that Mao manages to escape this wrath quite successfully, which is again an interesting aspect of the Cultural Revolution and the mass psychology that goes with it. Well, thanks for listening this morning anyway. We're doing a slightly different format at the moment, where we'll do a Monday podcast, a Friday podcast, and a midweek review. So I hope that that's something you guys will enjoy. I think it's already a good way of balancing things out. If you can give us a good review, assuming you like this, of course, on iTunes, that would be fantastic. It makes all the difference to this podcast, and it's the best way you can show your support. Thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best, bye-bye.